If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich.
Big business is using the stock market slump as a means of forcing you to come to terms with business. Their attitude is, now we have you where they want you. Have you seen any reflection of this attitude?
I can't believe I'm where big business wants me.
We are anxious to live in harmony with the Russian people.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
A warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted and desperate view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. The hard reality of life in much of Latin America will not be solved simply by complaining about Castro, by blaming all problems on communism, or generals, or nationalism.
The Republican National Chairman has said that your administration's attitude in general is one of appeasement toward communism throughout the world. Do you have any comment on this criticism by top spokesmen of the opposition party?
No, I don't.
Well, these are fascinating clips, Gary, because communism was never a threat to the United States. On the contrary, the threat to the United States has always been fascism, the merger of big business with big government, leaving no one to protect the little man, the consumer, the worker. J. Edgar was therefore very useful to Wall Street by misdirecting attention away from the malfeasance, the frauds, the manipulation and the deception by the big firms, the financiers, the bankers, and instead focusing attention on a non-existent threat. In fact, we know there were cell meetings in the 1950s during which every person present was an informant for the FBI. It's that bad.
Still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique, among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago.
Being respectful to other nations isn't to be soft on communism, particularly when there was the potential for immense cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States. Indeed, it was among JFK's proposals to Nikita Khrushchev that they might share their technical and scientific resources in a project to send man to the moon that may have been one of the contributing factors to the Joint Chiefs' decision to support his removal from office by means of assassination on the ground that he was placing the nation's security at risk by sharing such highly classified information. But indeed, JFK was right, and they were wrong.
Our primary long-range interest in Geneva, however, is general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace, that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction, unleashed by science, engulf all humanity.
It is therefore our intention to challenge the Soviet Union, not to an arms race, but to a peace race. Let us call a truce to terror.
What JFK is doing here is paying respect to the Soviet Union and the immense sacrifice it paid during World War II in particular to defeat the forces of the Third Reich. That is a form of morality among nations where he is taking into account the complete historical context and acknowledging the sacrifices of the Soviet Union in defeating a common enemy. This is a very appropriate and magnanimous statement on his part, which, however, narrow pedestrian minds here in the United States especially would fail to appreciate in its full significance and undoubtedly hold against him rather than admire for his generosity of spirit, his commitment to truth, and his appreciation for history.
Let us call a truce to terror. The logical place to begin is a treaty assuring the end of nuclear tests of all kinds in every environment under workable control. We also proposed a mutual ban on atmospheric testing without inspection or control in order to save the human race from the poison of radioactive fallout. Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames.
He recognized it as terror, the nuclear threat as terror.
Well, JFK was so far-sighted here that he anticipated not only, I think, the enormous potential of nuclear weapons, but even the hazards associated with nuclear energy. We have seen in Fukushima what may well be an extinction-level event as it evolves, where tremendous destruction is taking place to the Pacific Ocean, notwithstanding its immense proportions, and very large swaths of sea life are being decimated, with the potential ramifications for all species higher up on the food chain, where with the decimation of any level, all species above are destined for extinction. That he condemns terror is all too significant, because threats of terror have become the common practice among politicians today, who want to maintain the American people in a state of fear, so will feel increasingly dependent upon a government in spite of its betrayal of our own interests and promotion of its own political agenda.
50 years ahead of his time, a half a century ahead of his time.
By March 1954, the brushfire war in Indochina was almost 8 years old, and the French position had deteriorated. Hoping to draw the communist guerrillas into decisive open battle, the French made a stand at the fortress of Dien Bien Phu. But by mid-March, the French forces were surrounded and cut off. Military aid from the United States had made it possible for France to maintain the war. But in spite of an ever-increasing flow of supplies, the French cause appeared doomed. The question of American military intervention was raised.
This might have serious risks, but these risks are far less than would face us a few years from now if we dare not be resolute today.
That was Truman saying that if we don't take action today in Vietnam, we will pay consequences later.
Well, it's very disturbing that Harry S. Truman, who was in so many ways such a very good man, should have failed to appreciate that the French were fighting a colonial war with the Vietnamese nationalists, that there were historic animosities between Vietnam and China, that Vietnam was not a communist nation in the sense in which China was a communist nation, that there was going to be no fall of dominoes in Southeast Asia. All classic forms of lies were sold then, which have been repeated more recently endlessly in relation to Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and now even Ukraine, with the artificial contrivance of Russian threats to Ukraine when the United States, in fact, invested $5 billion to create Ukrainian unrest, smuggled Russian weapons in to fire on demonstrators to blame it on the Russians or their supporters in the Ukraine, and caused the democratically elected governor of the Ukraine to flee for his life. And now, of course, the United States is maintaining that Russia is invading Ukraine. It's all poppycock. It's unbelievable, but Russia most certainly has a legitimate national security interest in Ukraine, which historically has been a major part of Russia, where Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's an advisor to Obama, has observed that Russia without Ukraine is crippled. It's not going to happen. We make national security claims about events going on thousands and thousands of miles across enormous oceans that really pose no threat whatsoever to the United States and its national security. Here we have a major nation on the border, contiguous with Russia, historically closely related, where obviously there's a legitimate Russian national security interest. I mean, the American commentators are simply puppets for the CIA, sad to say, and it's very unfortunate that we hear Harry Truman falling into a snare, a cesspool, quicksand, what would become Vietnam, which would lead to the over 50,000 deaths of American and over 2 million Vietnamese.
All right, here's John F. Kennedy saying that we should have told the French to get out of there 5 years ago.
I think that we should have insisted 4 or 5 years ago that the French get out of French Indochina and permit a free native government to set up as we did in Indonesia in the case of the Dutch.
Military action in Indochina. French regulars land along the coast in search of roving communist bands. For France, it represents a tremendous sacrifice of manpower and financial resources. Without American help, the burden would be too great.
Well, JFK was wise here, and of course he would receive counsel from both Dwight D. Eisenhower and from General Douglas MacArthur that the United States ought not to become involved in a land war in Asia. And if the country had only listened to JFK, we would have been so much better off. The situation is unbelievable as history would unfold. It would show once again how wise he was to commit us to not becoming further involved, his desire to get us out of Vietnam, even the advisors that we had sent. And if only we had followed that advice, the world would be a different place today.
All right, here is Richard Nixon. And after this clip, can you please talk to us about who Richard Nixon was at this time in history, not who we remember later on in Watergate. All right, here's the first time that the domino effect is ever uttered by a politician, and it's Richard Milhouse Nixon.
I think perhaps if we go over to the map here, I can indicate to you why it is so vitally important. Here is Indochina. If Indochina falls, Thailand is put in an almost impossible position.
Nixon becomes one of the first hawks to warn of the domino effect of communist aggression.
That indicates to you and to all of us why it is vitally important that Indochina not go behind the Iron Curtain.
One year later, in 1954, French forces are besieged by the communists at a place called Dien Bien Phu. A massive resupply operation fails to tip the balance. Nixon is one of the first to favor military intervention, but President Eisenhower won't commit troops to a ground war in Asia. Nixon supports the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but Ike says the sun is still shining. Dien Bien Phu isn't the end of the world. Dien Bien Phu falls. The French surrender. In Geneva, a peace conference leaves Vietnam divided into a communist north and a non-communist south. But there is to be no peace in Vietnam.
Under pressure of growing communist aggression, the flow of American equipment and advisors has increased.
In the 1950s, Nixon backs the deployment of American military advisors to South Vietnam.
Superior equipment and mobility are used to full advantage to carry the fight to the enemy swiftly, wherever his presence becomes known.
Richard Nixon supports the use of tactical nuclear weapons. What would that have meant if John Kennedy would not have been elected?
Well, it's unfortunate, Gary, that today the United States has been employing tactical nuclear weapons in Iraq. Christopher Busby, an internationally recognized authority on the relationship between cancer and health and its causes, discovered this during research on birth defects in Fallujah, which he had initially believed were the result of the use of depleted uranium, but which turned out to be the effects of enriched uranium from a new class of tactical weapons. Even 9/11 appears to have involved the destruction of the Twin Towers using a sophisticated arrangement of mini or micro nukes. We're in a very bad way here when the United States is violating international accords on the use of nuclear weapons. And, you know, Richard Nixon in that respect was ahead of his time in suggesting that they might have been used in Vietnam. We were doing all kinds of grotesque things in Vietnam, including Agent Orange, which, of course, itself also brings about massive birth defects, and where, you know, other forms of weapons that we ought not to have used have been used in the Gulf Wars, where Gulf War syndrome is actually a direct effect of the kinds of weapons that we have been deploying in violation of international law. The United States has sunk into a quagmire of lawlessness and disrespect for international law, and a nation that regularly does not acknowledge the sovereignty of other nations by flying, for example, drones over Pakistan, even though the government protests, threatening to lob cruise missiles into Syria on a false pretext, and other forms of intervention that have become a way of life for the United States.
When the Joint Chiefs were screaming for a first preemptive nuclear strike on Russia, what do you think would happen if they were screaming to Richard Nixon? In other words, replace Kennedy with Nixon in that scenario that day.
Well, it's all too threatening, Gary, that Richard Nixon might have gone along with it. You know, I mean, he was a great anti-communist. He was pretended to be, you know, an international statesman, and he would have wanted to show that he had courage and conviction by launching a nuclear war. And I think had that been the case, you know, you and I would not be having this conversation today.
Nixon almost became the president by just 100,000 votes or so, if I'm not mistaken. So it was just so close, it had to be almost divine intervention. Here we go.
Under pressure of growing communist aggression, the flow of American equipment and advisors has increased.
In the 1950s, Nixon backs the deployment of American military advisors to South Vietnam.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, it was Richard Nixon that deployed the 16,000 military advisors.
That's right. This was a situation that JFK inherited from the Eisenhower-Nixon administration. Nixon had also been the point man in the creation of Operation 40, which was a group of assassins that would subsequently even be used in part to take out JFK himself. It's an unfortunate legacy of Richard Nixon and a stain on the reputation of Dwight D. Eisenhower that these things should have come to pass during their administration.
All right, well, we've got a clip of Dwight D. Eisenhower saying that how important it is that we may not have access to the tungsten in Vietnam.
If Indochina goes, several things happen right away. The Kra Peninsula, the last little bit of end hanging on down there, would be scarcely defensible. The tin and the tungsten that we so greatly value from that area would cease coming.
Well, in retrospect, it's fascinating to hear these remarks from Eisenhower, because the only time I ever heard a rational explanation for why we were in Vietnam was a half-an-hour program broadcast on CBS and narrated by Walter Cronkite, which, as I recall, was in 1968, where he displayed a a map of the continental shelf off of Vietnam and how the international oil companies had already divided it up among themselves. But what Eisenhower is saying here, tungsten provides an additional reason for wanting to invade, to obtain the natural resources of another country to benefit American corporations. It's very like what's gone on in Afghanistan, which is loaded with vast mineral deposits and includes one of the world's largest supplies of lithium, which is used in electric car batteries as components in computers, as triggers for nuclear weapons. So that, we're not only in Vietnam protecting the poppy crop for the benefit of the CIA, which has become the biggest drug running operation in the world, but to, loot that nation of its natural resources. It's a shame, but this is a pattern we have found the United States practicing again and again and again. For those who have any doubt, read John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman and understand the world you are inhabiting today.
You're listening to The Real Deal. We'll be right back with Dr. James Fetzer and Gary King.
Hi, this is Gary King. Here's a cutoff from my album, Sometimes Less Is More, available on iTunes if you dig it, download it. Don't forget, Sometimes Less Is More on iTunes.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, continuing my conversation with Gary King for the new JFK Show, number 26.
The letters and the reports we had on Ho Chi Minh's attitude back in 1946. He wrote, I think it was 7 letters to this government and received no reply. The pathos, almost, the sadness that here's a man who felt and believed the United States would be sympathetic to his purpose of gaining his independence from a colonial power. And then to find this is what he'd read, he'd been here, he'd read our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. He thought surely the United States would be interested. We had testimony in the committee that his one worry was that it was so insignificant. Vietnam was so far away and so insignificant, we would never bother about it. It's too small to ever attract the attention of the United States. He was sure in his own mind that if we would ever put our minds and focus upon it, we would be for him. How different history would have been for us and for them if we had felt a common interest in the colonial province like Vietnam, seeking its independence of France.
Ho Chi Minh was a great nationalist leader. I mean, this has happened repeatedly around the world, where a nationalist leader wants to benefit his people, is targeted by the United States and branded as a communist because of the desire of American corporations to appropriate the national resources of that country. This happened not only with Ho Chi Minh in relation to Vietnam, it happened with Fidel Castro in relation to Cuba, where United Fruit and Anaconda Copper were upset at the nationalization of their properties. It happened with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela when he nationalized the oil companies. It happened with Muammar Gaddafi, who was abandoning the petrodollar and who wouldn't allow Rothschild's banks to enter, with Saddam Hussein when he again abandoned the petrodollar and again was not open to the Rothschild banking empire. I mean, even Iran to this day is being targeted because it's abandoned the petrodollar and gone to an international oil bourse. And of course, it's also developing, fuel rods for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. The American nuclear energy industry can't compete with Iran. and therefore wants it to be suppressed and not even to have allow the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, even though that's, of course, acknowledged under international law to be among its rights, its legitimate rights. So we have a whole history here. Smedley Butler, who was a two-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner, a fascinating figure, observed in his reflections, war is a racket, that he had used his troops, his Marines, to defend the interests of American corporations time and time again, and he enumerated about 16 different ventures in Latin America and South America where they'd been deployed for that purpose. American people have to understand that our military is used not to bring democracy or liberty or freedom to other nations, but to benefit corporations, increasingly transnational corporations, that bear no allegiance to the United States and more often than not seek to evade even paying taxes. So they want to benefit and exploit the military resources of the United States for their own private benefit to maximize their profits. It's disgusting, but it's the history, the real history, the hidden history of the United States of America.
And it's shocking to the American people that it wasn't really all about freedom and democracy. All right, we've got Fletcher Prouty talking about the president he was working with to get us out of Vietnam.
Colonel Fletcher Prouty.
At the time of the Kennedy assassination, I was the Chief of Special Operations in the Joint Staff, working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Special Operations in those days was a euphemism for the military support of the clandestine operations of CIA around the world.
Prouty was an insider who claimed that while some in the Pentagon were gearing up for war, he was secretly helping President Kennedy plan for peace.
So during the summer, July, August, and September, he had a very experienced group of people work on his new policy for Vietnam. It was published in October, and it was called the National Security Action Memorandum number 263. And that memorandum, signed under the direction of the president, was to bring men home by Christmas and get everybody out by 1965.
Did that policy change after the assassination?
Only 4 days later.
What happened?
4 days later, under Lyndon Johnson, they issued a new National Security Action Memorandum, number 273, which began a modest change. Then in March of '64, another memorandum, 288, began the attacks on North Vietnam and the escalation of the war.
And in my last conversation with him, I'll always remember it, he said, as soon as the election is over, I'm going to get the boys out of Vietnam. To myself, I've always said there would have been never that great disaster that we had. The loss of lives that he had he lived.
Fletcher Prouty is revealing here the inner workings of the mind of JFK in extracting American advisors from Vietnam, where they've been positioned by the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, and gives us a further recognition of his commitment to world peace and not allowing the United States to become caught in the quicksand of a war in Asia. Again, we see JFK far, far ahead of his time. In fact, if we had leadership as enlightened as he was then at the helm of the United States today, we would not be engaged in all of these wars around the world, seemingly endlessly to benefit American corporations.
So we have Kennedy saying that it would be a mistake to withdraw from Vietnam, talking to Walter Cronkite.
Now it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That'd be a great mistake. That'd be a great mistake. I know people don't like Americans to be engaged in this kind of an effort. 47 Americans have been killed in combat with the enemy.
Gary, on some occasions, JFK would imply his support for the current or enduring policy in Vietnam, where he intended to take the actions of completing the removal after his re-election in 1964. He wanted, I think, to do more spade work to prepare the American people for what he intended to do and that in interviews like those with Walter Cronkite, he simply had judged that the context, the timing wasn't right yet to reveal his hand and give the Republicans an additional issue to use against him in the 1964 campaign.
As famous as this clip is, Dr. Fetzer, I don't think I've ever heard you comment on it.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
President Eisenhower warned the nation of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. A permanent war economy was their business, with billions at stake.
This is indeed a celebrated statement by Dwight D. Eisenhower warning us against the military-industrial complex. Originally, I understand it was to be the military-industrial congressional complex, Gary, but his advisors were concerned that that might antagonize members of the House and Senate, especially the Senate, that he needed to, he wanted to respond positively to his concerns, and therefore the term congressional was omitted. But without any doubt, it is a military intelligence congressional complex where so many of the members of the Senate, for example, are under the thumb of the AIPAC, the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, which JFK, by the way, wanted to have formally classified as a foreign agent because, of course, its immense influence representing the interests of Israel. That would have been devoutly to be wished. But, of course, with his assassination, Lyndon Johnson not only pursued the war aggressively and abandoned any overtures for peace or normalization of relations with Fidel Castro, but also, of course, went on to promote the interests of the military-industrial congressional complex rather than rein them in.
All right, Kennedy, saying for himself, the goal is to get out of Southeast Asia.
Give us your appraisal of the situation in South Vietnam now since the coup and the purposes for the Honolulu conference.
Well, because we do have a new situation and a new government to attempt to assess the situation, what American policy should be, what our aid policy should be, how we can intensify the struggle, how we can bring Americans out of there. Now, that is our object, to bring Americans home.
All right, that's the object, to bring Americans home.
Yes, and that's indeed the right thing to have done, just as we should close our 700 or more bases around the world, but stop conducting these wars at vast distances that represent no threat to American national security. Stop using our forces to benefit corporations and exploit the natural resources of other countries. Gary, it's almost endless. If only we had had individuals of the quality of education and intelligence and wisdom of JFK in office. Since then, the world would be a completely different place than it is today.
I just wish more people would realize that. All right, here's McNamara saying that we were going to get out.
October 2nd, I had returned from Vietnam. At that time, we had 16,000 military advisors. I recommended to President Kennedy and to the Security Council that we establish a plan and an objective of removing all of them within 2 years. Kennedy announced we were going to pull out all of our military advisors by the end of 65. We're going to take 1,000 out at the end of 63, and we did.
All right, he's not going to maintain that line of thought for very long.
Gary, it's just outrageous. I mean, we have multiple forms of confirmation. There's some who have gone so far as to claim that JFK and Bobby were planning to invade Cuba again. Lamar Waldron and Tom Hartman, who's otherwise a very fine person, speaking of Hartman, embraced the idea of C-Day, Cuba Day, and that Bobby and Jack were keeping it under wraps. But it's preposterous that any such plan could have been in the works. It would have discredited the United States in the eyes of the world because JFK had entered into solemn agreements not to reinvade Cuba. And of course, Robert McNamara has observed that he had no knowledge or awareness of any such plan. And indeed, he's also affirmed that JFK had planned to extract us from Vietnam, even though there are revisionist historians who want to maintain that Jack was proceeding full scale with the Vietnam War because that benefits their own political positions. It's a shame, and it's a disgrace that Lamar Waldron and Thomas Hartman should have, in a book first entitled Ultimate Sacrifice, which they then republished, which I reviewed under the heading Ultimate Rubbish. You can find it on Amazon.com. It's sad how many have lost their way addressing the issues of foreign policy in relation to JFK.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that one of the greatest documentaries of all time is called Evidence of Revision, just like you were saying. We've got Fletcher Prouty saying that the power elite don't have to vote. They just say he's got to go.
The way that struck people who were leaning toward the profits and the benefits of the Vietnam War was really unimaginable. You can't imagine. So a power elite coalesces. They don't have to vote. And among them, they say, that guy's got to go.
Well, you're talking about the sponsors of the assassination of JFK, who included the CIA, because he was threatening to shatter it into 1,000 pieces. The Joint Chiefs, he'd not invaded Cuba against their unanimous recommendation. He'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, contrary to the unanimous opposition. Now he was going to pull our forces out of Vietnam, where they felt a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism. The anti-Castro Cubans, who wanted revenge in the false belief that JFK had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs. The Mafia wanted to stop the unceasing crackdown on organized crime that Bobby was spearheading. The Texas oilmen were apprehensive he was going to cut the oil depletion allowance. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed were alarmed that he'd instructed the Department of the Treasury to print hundreds of millions of United States notes, circumventing the Fed on the ground that it was absurd for the government to pay a consortium of private banks interest for printing the currency of the United States. And, of course, Israel, because JFK was at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, who wanted Israel to develop nuclear weapons, which JFK opposed. That was a powerful array, and it was not difficult to, coalesce or support that sentiment, where Lyndon Johnson, as then vice president and a former Senate Majority Leader, was in a unique position to tie together all of the disparate elements, which Noel Twyman, by the way, has brilliantly analyzed in his book Bloody Treason, a masterpiece of over 700 pages studying the individuals and groups that came together to bring about the death of JFK.
Is there any speed up in the withdrawal from Vietnam? As you know, when Secretary McNamara and General Taylor came back, they announced that we would expect to withdraw 1,000 men from South Vietnam before the end of the year.
All right, that was JFK himself saying that he wanted to withdraw 1,000 by Christmas time.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, JFK, what a wonderful Christmas present for the American people and for the world, that the United States not be engaged in one more hostile takeover of otherwise what should be a sovereign nation led by a great nationalist leader who wanted to benefit the Vietnamese people, Ho Chi Minh.
And could not believe that the American people would not hold them. The American people would have, but power it be would not allow that to happen. That was just a mirage of them that Americans were under and are still under today.
As a result of what we have done in South Vietnam, not only has the psychology changed there.
All right, this is Nixon talking about how the psychology has changed in South Vietnam.
As a result of what we have done in South Vietnam, not only has the psychology changed there, but also it has had a most beneficial effect, in my opinion, among other free Asian countries who looked at South Vietnam as a test.
Well, it's outrageous, Gary. It's just one more illustration of, the claim that we're doing this benefiting other countries to bring them democracy and freedom. Look at Iraq. Anyone who doesn't believe that Iraq was better off under Saddam Hussein than it is today simply doesn't understand the situation now. In fact, it's been the Israeli plan to destroy the secular governments of nations like Iraq and Syria and Libya, so that these historical animosities between different religious groups, such as the Shia and the Sunni, should come into play and, in effect, balkanize those nations into little parts that pose no threat to the domination of the Middle East by Israel. They're very good at playing the game, and we, alas, have been suckers and been drawn right in to do their dirty work in the Middle East. It's a sad state of affairs, but there it is.
This is LBJ saying that McNamara should modify his speech to include at least 2 minutes on Vietnam and how we should be bringing freedom, peace, and democracy to their country.
Bob? Yes, Mr. President. I hate to modify your speech any, because it's been a good one, but I just wonder if we should find 2 minutes in there for Vietnam. You know, the problem is what to say about it. All right, I'll tell you what I would say about it. I would say that we have a commitment to Vietnamese freedom. We could pull out of there, the dominoes would fall, and that part of the world would go to the communists.
Well, it's more disinformation propaganda. I mean, the American people have to worry, you know, we have to be fearful that something bad is going to happen in order to be manipulated by our government, which has gone so far today that they now commit atrocities, fabricated events like Sandy Hook and the Boston bombing in order to instill fear into the public. It's tragic, Gary, but in those instances we see acts of terrorism being committed by the American government on the American people, because terrorism involves instilling fear into a population to make it more amenable to political manipulation. That's precisely what has taken place in those instances. Sandy Hook with respect to the Second Amendment and surrendering our rights under the Bill of Rights, and in the case of Boston, the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure, with the additional consideration of effectively undermining posse comitatus, which a statute passed in 1878 that precludes the use of military force to perform police functions. What has been done now is to militarize the police by sending them all this military equipment, which we saw most stunningly in Ferguson recently, and I'm hopeful that some benefit will derive therefrom by, causing the Congress to reconsider the Pentagon Policy 1033 that provides all this surplus military equipment to local police, because once they have it in hand, they abandon the traditional role to serve and protect the community and begin treating their own citizens as though they were enemies, using weapons that they don't really understand, should not possess, and can only cause great grief to communities, as indeed was the case in Ferguson.
Great summation of what happened in '63 has manifested what we have today right there in St. Louis.